So I'm almost done with this book on Chinese history, and I'd like to learn as much as I can from it so that, a year from now or even 10 years from now, I'll have a decent understanding of Chinese history. So in this video, I explain how I try to do that and what I might do differently next time. Chinese history is full of dates and names that sound similar and similar events that aren't quite the same. There's just a lot that goes on in 5,000 years. As I've been reading, I've been doing some free recall exercises and I've been telling the most interesting tidbits to my wife. But those things alone are not really enough to learn from a book like this. How do I learn everything I can from this book? Now, before I talk about what I did, I want to talk about what understanding something means. Some people tend to think that if they could just take a photograph of this book and put it in their brain, all the words and the sentences and the maps and the diagrams, if they could just do that, then that would mean that they really learned from this book. You could just have that book in your brain whenever you wanted it. I think that's a misconception about what learning and understanding something means. I think a more reasonable approach is to think of the book as a resource to learn from. So of course, in a book about history, there are going to be important people and important events and important dates and all these kinds of things. But there are also patterns and themes and different sources of conflicting evidence and uncertainty even. We're not reading this book just to know what happened in the past. We're reading it to make sense of what happened in the past. Now, one of the best ways that I know of to understand something is to organize it and reorganize it in different ways as you dig into the material. As you pull the dates and the names and the people together into patterns and themes, you're helping yourself to remember as well, because things that make sense are easier to remember. The first thing I did was to just write down the different themes that seem to come up when reading about Chinese history. Now, some of these themes are made pretty explicit in the book throughout the different chapters, and other times these are more my observations from reading and based on what I already know. As usual, I write these themes down without referencing the book at first. Let me give you a sense of what these themes are in this case. There are several famous explorers throughout Chinese history. Zhang Qian from the Han Dynasty, who makes it to the Persian Empire, reports back to China on the wider world. There's Xuanzong, who lived in the Tang Dynasty, who travels as a Buddhist monk, goes to India and has many adventures along the way. Zhang He from the Ming Dynasty, who travels in these giant warships, the biggest ships at the time during the Ming Dynasty, travels kind of all around Southeast Asia and even into Africa. There are certain similarities to these explorations, but then there are also certain differences as well. Another pattern that emerges in Chinese history is that there's kind of the short dynasty that sets everything up but pisses everyone off, that is then overthrown by a much more popular and long-lasting dynasty who basically does the exact same thing and takes advantage of all the infrastructure that was built during that shorter failed dynasty to have a kind of long, successful reign. You see this with the Qin and the Han dynasty, you see this with the Sui and the Tang dynasty, and there are many other moments in Chinese history that are kind of like this. Something else I did, I wrote down the major dynasties and the eras as well as I could remember them. I have all these different ideas, these different events and these different stories. How do I want to organize them together? How do they all fit together in a way that makes sense? Now, the meat of what I'm doing is writing down and organizing what I know, finding gaps in my understanding and filling in those gaps by going back to the book or maybe going online if I think that it's faster or easier to go online to find the answer to my question. And I just do that over and over and over again. Up here, I initially started to write down some of the major figures from different eras, kind of stopped doing that and spent more time writing out these narratives that I remember from these eras. And again, I'm doing that without reference to the book until I'm finished writing, and then I go back and look at the book to see what I didn't understand. Now you can see it here. Sometimes I've highlighted things that I'm a little uncertain about or that I need to check in again with. The advantage of doing this goes beyond just filling in the gaps that you didn't know. Because when you bounce back and forth between your own thoughts or reflections and the book, what happens is when you go back to read the book, you see the material in the book differently. The different kinds of details are going to stick out to you now, because now you've changed the prior knowledge that you're going into the book with. So you're trying to help yourself kind of scaffold your way to deeper and deeper understanding of the material. Whereas if you had just read the book through once, you would have only gotten some of the most obvious things and most prominent or attention-grabbing things. And this probably looks incomplete and sloppy, but I'm not finished with it yet. I kind of wanted to make a bigger point here, which is that some people think that the notes are really important, like that the completeness of the notes or the clarity of the notes is a really important thing to have. It's far more important what's actually in your head. Now, the notes are a reflection of what's in your head. So in that sense, yeah, a clear notes probably represents clear thinking. But the function of the notes is really to enable you to have a conversation with yourself. When the notes help you to think about the material, that's good. But when you're doing something, say because that's the format that someone told you that you need to do it in, or because you're copying something out of a book from memory, or something like that, you're not really struggling with reorganizing it in a way that makes sense to you. You want to find different paths through the material. One path might be looking at population change over time in China and the causes of that population change. Another path might be about economic changes, about how taxes are collected and differences in how people grow crops and distribute goods. Another path might be about different sources of religious influences and how those impacted how people thought about, say, the emperor's role and the royal family's role in managing China. Now, for this particular project, you notice I'm using this visualization software called Miro, but I'm not really taking advantage of the visualization affordances in this program. So there's just a lot of text. And I think this is partly a result of me and partly a result of the subject matter. The way I've been trained is to think with writing. So it really helps me to think through things when I write them. And I'm not as adept at creating, say, a visualization that captures my thoughts as easily. I also think that in this particular case, history kind of lends itself to writing a little bit more. And as time goes on, I'll probably add more visualizations, which can help consolidate a lot of complex information sometimes in a kind of neat, easy to understand form. When I put things in an external form like this, it helps me to see relationships that I might not otherwise see if I was just speaking all of this out loud. So I've done this note-taking free recall process, and I did this out loud story time with my wife, and now I'm engaged in this back and forth organizational process. But as I was engaged in this organizational process, I discovered that the specific dates when things happen kind of eluded me. Now, I put off understanding dates in the beginning because if you just memorize a bunch of dates and they don't really have meaning to you, then I don't find that to be that helpful. But now that I have a better understanding of kind of the overall picture and I want to understand more precise cause and effect relationships, like I'd like to know, is this guy alive during this event? Like that would be interesting. This event probably shaped his understanding and his opinion about what's going on. I want to know that. So I wanted to do something a little bit different so that I really pinned down those dates. And basically I did a kind of modified flashcard testing system. So I wrote down the dates that I knew were important, and I wrote down some of the events that I knew were important. And these are going to serve as kind of flashcards for me later, like timelines that I can test myself on. I can either start from the date and go to the event. I can start at the event and go to the date. I can talk about, this era, this 100 years. There are different ways of using it for self-testing, but I want to create a resource for myself where I know that these are the events that I think are important. These are the dates that I think are important. This is how to get deeper into the material. You might ask, why these visualizations? Why these charts? Why break things up like this? And the answer is just that I thought about it. Whenever we're learning something, we're always trying to make sense of the material, so I'm trying to take steps that help me make sense of the material. There's never going to be one visualization or one organizing framework to rule them all. It's just like there's never going to be a perfect map of any particular area. There are good maps and there are bad maps, but different maps also just do different things. There are trade-offs when you create a map because you have to decide which information is more important. Is elevation important? Is the location of the rivers very important? Are things like addresses important to you? Are electrical lines important to you? Are sewage lines important to you? So I'm going to keep going like this, refining my understanding over time, but there's something else that I need to do to make things really stick in the long term. I'm setting a date a few months from now where I will try to recreate what I am creating here. And I might take, little bits of time over the course of a week to try to do that. And then eventually I'll go back to what I created to kind of fill in the gaps and see what I didn't remember, and maybe even go back to the book or to the internet to kind of get a bigger, better overall picture of things. This process just helps us stretch out the amount of time that we have seen the material. It doesn't matter how focused I am right now, how hard I try to remember all this stuff right now. If I don't use it for the next 2 years, 3 years, a lot of it will just be gone. I want to put a disclaimer here because I cannot say that this is the best way to learn from a book. I decided to try to understand this book deeply, and I just kind of bumbled my way through it. There are some things I would probably do differently next time. One would be to do my note-taking or free recall sessions more frequently as I was reading the book. There were times when I was just reading and I was just so excited about what was happening next that I just kind of got wrapped up in the story, and I didn't take the time to sit down, reflect, take some notes, understand what's going on, really consolidate what I knew before moving on to the next chapter, the next section. I think if I would have built my knowledge a little bit more slowly, it wouldn't have been so overwhelming or intimidating at the end, and it would have helped me understand the next sections more deeply the first time around. One of the other things that comes up when reading history books is geography. This city is north of that city, northeast of that city by 500 kilometers. Just reading that is not really the best way of understanding how all of these places fit together and what their attributes are. If I were to go back in time, I would have kind of built up a little map for myself of Greater Asia so that I knew what they were talking about when they were talking about it. I did do this little dinky map thing a couple of times. I tried to do that much later on, but if I would have done that at the beginning and build up a map over time, I think that would have been more helpful. Another thing I would do is try to incorporate more self-testing into the process. I didn't start to do this until relatively late. I have played around with GPT to get it to ask me essay questions based on the notes that I've taken. That kind of works a little bit, but really the best thing that I can imagine doing is reading a book with a partner or with maybe a couple of other people. You're all reading the book, you're all really trying to understand as much as you can. You come into, say, group sessions and you each ask each other questions and have develop your thoughts and understanding. In my experience, when you're collaborating with someone like this, it can really lead you to deeper, better understandings of the material that you could never get just on your own because you're just always inside your own head. But anyhow, I'm sure I will have other improvements in the future. I'm going to keep doing this as I read more nonfiction books. And if you like this video, if this was the kind of thing that was interesting to you, let me know in the comments, because then I can make updates to this video to show how my methods are progressing over time, as well as how these methods should change depending on the kind of book you're reading or the kind of subject matter that you're tackling. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.